5.
Let's just think about this, Liam. Labour last lost a seat in Wales in 1931, okay? It's hard to overstress how strong this is.
4.
Disaster having 1 million young people who are, say, not in employment, education or training.
3.
My unsalted French butter habit is going to be like some of the more expensive champagne at the moment.
2.
Are you telling me it's only 3.8% more expensive to live than this time last year? Absolutely not. It's far more than that.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. It's good to be with you, co-pilot, on the rocket of right thinking as we head for Planet Normal. And this is our first voyage since last Thursday's by-election for the Welsh parliamentary seat of Caerphilly, with Labour losing in that constituency for the first time in over a century, signalling the beginning of the end, perhaps, of the party's historic dominance in the land of your fathers. The Caerphilly seat went to Welsh nationalist Plaid Cymru on 47% of the vote, with Reform UK on 36%, as Labour's vote share plunged from 46% in 2021 to just 11%, a seismic shift pointing to big changes at the next general election. The broader political landscape is confusingly rugged, to say the least. A new poll puts Reform still well ahead, backed by 27% of voters, with Labour and the Tories neck and neck on 17%, but the Greens are on 16% and the Lib Dems are on 15%. With so many potentially 4 or even 5-way marginal contests whenever the next Westminster election happens, the deadline is August 2029, the shape of the next UK Parliament is anyone's guess. Against that backdrop, Labour's rape gang inquiries falling to pieces as a string of victims resign amid accusations of control. The cost of living crisis is ongoing, as captured in your "Have you seen the price of mints?" column in Wednesday's Telegraph, Alison. Link in the show notes. And I've been writing in the Telegraph about UK government borrowing, ahead of what looks like another Rachel Reeves tax bombshell budget statement on Wednesday, November the 26th. Again, link to that in the show notes. But before we start reading the Welsh runes, Alison, let's just hark back to our last Planet Normal episode, recorded live at the brilliant Battle of Ideas Festival with our two wonderful guests, Lord Maurice Glassman, he of Blue Labour fame, and round-the-world yachting legend Tracy Edwards. Probably our most raucous episode ever. It had to be bleeped out by our Planet Normal editors.
You kept shooting me glances, Halligan. It wasn't quite sure whether when Morris was in full flow about dragging every rape gang complicit official into a TV show trial. Absolutely brilliant. By the way, before we talk about that, I think we know now what you're getting for your Christmas present. A packet of butter. That's going to be... packet of butter and a Milky Way. I tell you, it's going to be a frugal Christmas, but we'll have lots of time.
You don't need to go to such expense, Alison. That's far too extravagant.
Yeah, it really is far too,
Just give me a block of lard and I'll be happy.
My unsalted French butter habit is going to be like some of the more expensive champagne at the moment. But yeah, what a jolly time we had, Liam, didn't we? And could not have had two more superb guests. Tracy Edwards, phenomenal round-the-world yachtsman and incredibly principled now female campaigner for women's spaces, and Lord Glassman. Now, I know a number of Planet Normal listeners, sort of private, because I think a lot of listeners come to Planet Normal because they like to hear people who are in our orbit, don't they? They think we get enough of all the metropolitan nonsense elsewhere. Let's come to Planet Normal for some good common sense. But I think people were more than pleasantly surprised by Lord Glassman, who said, when I asked him what he thought about the prospects of Labour in my Welsh Wales, just said they were basically going to be kicked to death, I think was his...
They're going to get a righteous kicking, and rightly so.
And then described his beloved party not as Planet Normal, but Planet F, asterisk, 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 didn't he?
He certainly did. It was amazing. And the link to that episode, of course, you can find it. Just Google Planet Normal on the Telegraph's website, and you'll see all our episodes there. They're all on Spotify, the podcast app, and wherever. If you didn't catch last week's episode, it really is such fun. Lord Maurice Glassman, one of the most influential political thinkers in the UK at the moment, very much a thorn in Labour's side, despite that being his party. And Tracy Edwards, just a revelation, really. What an amazing public speaker. This is the woman who, in her mid-20s, decided that she was going to skip the world's first ever all-female crew to go round the world. And they came second in the Whitbread round the world yacht race when most of the rather snooty yachting press at the time thought they wouldn't make it beyond the Needles as they left the UK. So two brilliant, brilliant guests. We're so grateful to Claire Fox, Baroness Claire Fox, and the Battle of Ideas team for hosting us. But before we get on to that, Alison, I think we should start by talking about some really nasty footage that's been knocking around on the internet. A local man walking his dog, killed, we think, by an Afghan migrant. He is a suspect at this point, but the footage is incredibly shocking.
It certainly is, Liam. This is a local guy, Wayne Broadhurst in Uxbridge, was out walking his dog, as millions of ordinary British people are every day, and was multiply stabbed and tragically died. We know that a 14-year-old boy was also wounded after what the police called a shocking and senseless act of violence. As you know, Liam, I have been doing a big investigation into Asylum and have come across some absolutely explosive things. I think listeners will be profoundly shocked. In fact, I think the whole country will be profoundly shocked when the Telegraph publishes them. So stand by for that. So I'm really immersed in this topic at the moment. And police describe this suspected attack by the Afghan national, a man who came in illegally to our country in 2020 on a lorry and was granted asylum in 2022. Now, something Planet Normal listeners may not know and may be surprised to learn is that Afghanistan is one of what the Home Office calls high grant countries. And another absolutely horrifying case, Liam. I mean, there's just so many now. It feels like there's one a week, if not one a day. We saw this Sudanese asylum seeker, Deng Chol Majek, who listeners would have seen, murdered an asylum hotel worker, a woman who was working in the place. We had put him up, a young mother called Rhiannon White, who was stabbed by this Sudanese man 23 times in an absolutely horrendous attack. So we are letting in tens of thousands of men. And indeed, like the other asylum seeker who has made the news this week with this absolutely farcical carry on up the asylum seeker story, Hadush Kebatu, Ethiopian man who came ashore on the beaches, put up at great expense at the Bell Hotel in Epping, and 8 days after he arrived in the United Kingdom, sexually assaulted a schoolgirl. He was taken to jail. Then he was released by accident. He attempted to get back into prison 5 separate occasions, but they kept him going. I just want to say a couple of things. This is such a fraught story, and you can probably hear from my voice, Liam, how incensed I am. But I just want to say 2 things. Listeners are going to notice in the next few weeks and months that the Labour tactic now for this, including we've seen from Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, is to say, I was furious to see this man walking the streets. I was angry. I am angry that so many asylum hotels are being used. They are lying. They are lying. Behind the scenes, they are just trying to get these guys off the books as fast as possible, regardless of how dangerous they are. And that is what our government and our Home Office and our civil servants are doing. So the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister, when they say they're furious, they are furious about a dangerous situation which they are able to do something about, but choose not to. And how safe is that, Liam?
It's not safe at all, Alison. I was really shocked by this. I mean, I know Uxbridge well. I grew up in northwest London. You know, we used to dream of living in Uxbridge. You know, my lovely auntie lives in Uxbridge because her family did a little bit better than our family. It really is a beautiful, leafy place. It's part of suburbia. It's on the end of the Metropolitan line, but it does feel very rural. It's the kind of place that people aspire to live. And yet on the streets of Uxbridge, as somebody who we think was a local refuse collector, by all accounts very well liked, was out walking his dog. Now, that case is still suspected. Of course, we've got to be careful what we say about that case. But this, we know, as you say, that Hadesh Kabatu was an Ethiopian national who sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl and then was ridiculously released. We know Abdul Azidi, an Afghan who carried out a horrific chemical attack on a mother and her daughters in Clapham last year. He also came here illegally. The Moroccan guy who slaughtered Terence Carney in Hartlepool in 2023, Terence Carney, a defenceless pensioner, that was in revenge, we heard, for the Israel-Gaza conflict. He came here illegally. Now, obviously, by far, the majority of people who come to the UK come here legally. The legal migration numbers are enormous. They topped 1 million just a couple of years ago, and they're still very, very high. The number of illegal migrants is far, far fewer, but the angst about illegal migration is now really all about safety, because we don't know who people are. And the public is now really at the end of its tether. The electorate is being seriously radicalized by the incompetence of the state in managing this situation. And still the Labour Party goes down wormholes of accusing people of being racist in order to fill the airwaves. And the media do that too. I'm talking about the case of Sarah Pochin, of course, the Reform MP, who used some clumsy language, but she wasn't being racist. And yet the whole debate about this for another week was all about, you're being racist. No, I'm not. You're being racist. When the public's looking on, tearing its hair out about this. And I'm talking about moderate people, a lot of middle-aged women worried about their daughters who ordinarily would be voting Tory or Lib Dem. Really, really concerned now. And when you go to these protests outside some of the so-called asylum hotels, and you look at the people there, it's mums with pushchairs. It's young teenagers walking home from school, making their concerns felt. The political and media class still, I think, in the main, with some honourable exceptions, such as yourself, are yet to really understand the extent, not so much of public anger, though it's anger, but public fear. And I don't think anyone can be accused of fear-mongering by talking about this stuff. I think people can be accused of complete and utter reckless denial unless they don't talk about it.
That's right, Liam. And there was a very prominent story this week which jumped out, which was in the inquiry into the Southport massacre, which we've covered extensively on Planet Normal. And we can see this deliberate inversion of reality, which is happening throughout our institutions to appease the sort of diversity, equality and inclusion woke commissars. And there is absolutely no doubt that's happening across society. And at this inquiry into the Southport massacre of the 3 little Taylor Swift fans, a lady called Joanna Hodgson, now she was the former head teacher of Axel Rudakabana, who murdered the little girls. And she told the inquiry how her legitimate fears about this young killer were silenced. Now, Joanna Hodgson had huge experience working with disturbed teenagers at a special school, and she had written that Rudakabana was the most sinister pupil she'd ever come across. And there was an unnamed mental health worker who accused this head teacher of, quotes, racially profiling a black boy with a knife. And Joanna Hodgson said that the accusation had shut her up and closed her down professionally, despite what she said was a visceral sense of dread that Rudakabana was building up to something. Now, she was right, wasn't she, Liam? Her professional instincts were completely spot on. So 3 beautiful little girls might be alive today had this censorious enforcer of the pieties of multiculturalism been worrying a bit less about seeming racist and a bit more about the safety of British children. Now, in my column, I made a link actually with the case of Sarah Poachin, which you've just mentioned. Sarah is the Reform MP for Runcorn, which is a 97% white constituency. And Sarah was on a talk radio show and was asked about the disproportionate number of ethnic minority people in TV adverts. And she replied, "Oh, yes, that drives me mad." Now, as you said, Liam, her choice of words could have been a bit more tactful. She said, "Oh, yeah, they're full of black people." That wasn't the best possible way she could have expressed it. But the broader point, Liam, is that, which millions of people recognise, is that there is social engineering going on, not just in advertising, but in the culture in general, in TV drama and on radio. And broadcasting is heavily skewed towards the metropolitan view of life and against the experience of the majority of people who are a bit surprised to see all the Christmas ads for the supermarkets and discover that for some reason they don't live in a mixed race household. And just interesting to quote Channel 4's Mirror on the Industry audit, which found that black individuals appeared in over 50% of British TV adverts in 2022. That's up from 37% in 2020, despite the population representing only 4% of people in England and Wales. Now, I'm very happy to celebrate the achievement of our black actors and Asian actors, some of our finest performers, and so on. But for Keir Starmer to join the ugly pylon on Sarah Poachin for expressing completely legitimate views and accuse her of shocking racism, and it's the sort of thing that'll tear our country apart, said the Prime Minister. Au contraire, Prime Minister. What's going to tear our country apart is you and a Labour cabinet fighting tooth and nail to resist a proper focused national inquiry into the worst racially aggravated crime in our history, which is largely Pakistani origin rape gangs trafficking thousands of white working class girls. And you probably have seen, Liam, actually, that there was a Reform Party press conference where one of the survivors who was stepped aside from the rape inquiry,
Eliane Reynolds,
very impressive woman, and along with 3 other survivors, Eliane has refused to take part in it because they are worried that the scope of the inquiry is going to be so broadened and watered down that it will not be tackling the main issue. And the main issue, the reason the rape inquiry must focus on the Pakistani rape gangs, is because it was their ethnicity and religion that led to them being protected by public services, police, politicians, and social workers. You can't actually have a rape inquiry without mentioning that many of the perpetrators attacked the girls because they were white and dirty and non-Muslim. And that is just a fact.
So what do you think of the idea then, Alison? Because Farage and Reform said they don't trust this inquiry anymore. They want Jess Phillips, the Labour minister, removed. Jess and her friends will say she spent many years working in this area and standing up for women's rights and all the rest of it. Be that as it may, many people are now really concerned that the inquiry, which she is overseeing, is trying to manipulate these survivors, people who were raped many times as young girls. Eliane Reynolds, I thought, was absolutely remarkably coherent and articulate when faced with the national press. So chapeau to her. And Farage, they want to take this inquiry over, don't they? They want it to be a parliamentary inquiry now, like a select committee inquiry. But I think you've got some reservations about that, because such an inquiry wouldn't have the power of a judge-led inquiry to call anyone they wanted to then have to speak in a kind of quasi-judicial situation rather than a parliamentary inquiry, which, with the best will in the world, it can call people, but they don't actually have to legally turn up and give an account of themselves.
Yes, Liam, that's my concern, because I think we are talking about cover-up, national cover-up, absolutely shocking scandal. Maybe I'm not fully appreciating the powers that a parliamentary inquiry would have, but I think we're going to have to be such an inquiry is going to have to be summoning senior police officers, heads of social services, even some councillors who are now Labour MPs. So I think it's going to have as many teeth as possible. So I would still prefer to see a national judge-led inquiry. But as I said, I'm not 100% sure whether what reform is proposing would have enough power. But we certainly know Jess Phillips, and who has, I believe, about a 638 majority in her Birmingham constituency, very, very dependent on the Muslim vote, as are a surprising number of other Labour MPs and ministers.
We should really emphasise that, because a lot of commentators shy away from this electoral reality. Look, this grooming gang inquiry has been delayed and delayed and delayed. It was delayed under the Conservatives, we should say, although the current Conservative leader did speak up about this a great deal from the time she came into Parliament and as a junior minister. Everybody wanted to hush it up, but the Labour Party in particular wanted to hush it up because so often these ghastly events took place in Labour-run constituencies and councils, not least in the industrial towns of the north of England. Keir Starmer, the current Labour leader, of course, was Director of Public Prosecutions during a lot of this period when the investigations should have been happening. And as you say, Alison, there are many, many, many Labour constituencies where the majority held by the Labour MP is significantly smaller than the total Muslim population of those seats. And so Labour, which I would say explains a lot about Labour's foreign policy priorities over recent weeks and months, as an aside, but it also means that the party has been incredibly reticent in order to hold a national inquiry in the first place, any kind of inquiry. And I go back again, I've mentioned this a few times on Planet Normal over the last few years, but I will never forget as a young parliamentary reporter in the late 90s, getting to know Anne Cryer, the brilliant Labour MP for Keighley. And I got to know her well. I wasn't even reporting on what she was saying. I was with the Financial Times. I was meant to be at the Treasury Select Committee and doing all the nerdy financial stuff in Parliament. But I did get to know Anne Cryer, and she was absolutely determined for her party to respond to these grooming gang scandals, these child rape gang scandals in her constituency and elsewhere in her Yorkshire constituency. Another laudable Labour MP many years later, Sarah Champion, who tried to bring this up, they shut her up too. So Labour's got form on this, and I think the resignation of these various victims who they've got onto the inquiry, it seems as ornaments, as adornments, rather than actually wanting to hear from them. There have been reports of real manipulation of the victims on this investigation committee, who they're allowed to talk to, who they're not allowed to talk to, and so on. And of course, we've had a broader sense this week about the kind of concerns that a lot of people have who've worked in the Home Office, that it's not actually fit for purpose. That was John Reid's phrase, of course, the Labour Home Secretary back in the day. I have my differences with him. I do think he was broadly a decent man, certainly a courageous man when it came to speaking out about things that needed to be said. And then we've had a sort of similar verdict from Planet Normal's own Nick Timothy, the Tory MP, who is a great friend of this podcast, who's filled in as a presenter from time to time. Very, very bright guy. When he was working under Theresa May at the Home Office as an advisor, he was commissioned, I think, by Suella Braverman later on to do this report into the Home Office. And the Home Office mandarins have spent huge amounts of public time and money legally suppressing his report. It has now been published. It makes for very, very grim reading. And Shabana Mahmood is this great hope to be a reforming Home Secretary. Certainly on last week's Planet Normal, Lord Maurice Glassman was bigging her up. Are you convinced, Alison? Do you think Shabana Mahmood will be the reforming Home Secretary that we so desperately need?
Well, it seems like it's Michael Gove's phrase, wasn't it? It was the blob. The Home Office is like that sort of giant plant in the Little Shop of Horrors. Everyone goes in thinking they're going to be okay, and then they get swallowed by the giant plant. I mean, Suella Braverman, as we know, when she was the Home Secretary, she absolutely did her best to bring about changes, particularly in some of the things we've been talking about the asylum merry-go-round, Liam, where they can go on and on, coming up with different excuses. Oh, I'm gay. Oh, I'm Christian. Oh, I've got a budgie. I can't go back. And Suella tried to stop that. And she was thwarted at every turn. And there was, I think, the senior Home Office civil servant then, I think it was Sir Matthew Rycroft, if I'm correct. There's a lot of Sir Matthews around, Liam, and they don't much want investigations into what they see as their terrain. And just to say, it's quite interesting this week, we've had Danny Kruger, who's defected from the Conservatives to Reform, and Danny's been put in charge of preparing for government. And he has this week also come out with a report into how a Reform government would try and tackle this huge problem that the civil service is not acting at the behest of ministers as it's supposed to, but that it's the other way round. I mean, it's a complete abuse of the democratic system. And that it seems like even someone like Shabana Mahmood, who does seem to be very sincere about wanting to grip she's actually said, hasn't she, shockingly, that the government's basically lost control of our borders. But no matter how sincere she is she, as a senior elected government official, does her word go?
We know what the blob does, okay? When ministers get serious, when ministers really try and grip a problem, the blob, the civil service activists, accuse them of bullying.
Exactly.
And they're not above accusing a brown woman of bullying either, because that's what they did to Priti Patel. Michael Gove's been talking out about this over the last few days, because he was also accused of bullying when he was trying to get stuff done in Whitehall. And this just cannot happen. Of course, there have to be standards. Of course, civil service personnel are entitled to a workplace where they're not systematically harassed, as it were. But when you're dealing with very, very difficult situations, there's going to be a little bit of passion knocking about. You have to learn to deal with it. If not, go and get a different job. It strikes me that so many people now have entered Whitehall with their own political agenda. And I know plenty of civil servants, and, the Sir Matthews of this world, not least Sir Matthew Rycroft, they will deny wrongdoing. I'm of the age now where, a lot of my contemporaries at posh universities, they're now sort of senior people in Whitehall and so on. And some of the stuff they say to me, sitting on bar stools around SW1, it just shocks me.
Like what?
I think they're trying to impose their own politics on what the elected ministers of the day are trying to do. They're not there to impose their politics, but they feel as if they are. And I fear that the generation coming up behind us is even worse than that, in terms of they are going into the civil service to be activists, to change the world. If you want to change the world, run for office. If you want to change the world, even endure the brickbats and career insecurity that comes from being, a journalist, for instance. You can't be an activist on a sort of public sector pension. It's not fair.
Well, they drive away, don't they? Well said, but they drive away talented minds like Dominic Raab, who again, didn't they say that he was accused of having thrown a tomato noisily into a brown paper bag when he was having a sandwich? I mean, it's just absolutely beggars belief. But it's interesting that Danny Kruger is saying, right, we're going to have to rewrite the job description and plan to close down a huge amount of the Whitehall buildings to restore Whitehall to what it should actually be, which is from Parliament going up, it was stretching past the Cenotaph and number 10, not this huge sprawling empire.
With a third more people than in 2016. Despite, all the benefits of new technology and email and all the rest of it, there are a third more civil servants now than 2016. But Alison, we should just briefly talk about the Caerphilly by-election, because we're running out of time. You've got some tremendous insights into this, I think. We've talked about them before this recording, and we haven't had a chance to respond because this by-election happened only last Thursday. So after we recorded last week's Planet Normal, really incredible results. As I said in the opening, Labour's vote share going from 46% just 4 years ago to 11%. Absolutely astonishing. Some people thought Reform might win the seat. That would have been an incredible outcome. In the end, they got 36% of the vote. And the local Plaid Cymru candidate who's stood in this seat, multiple times, in the end, fair play to him. He got his victory finally, and he's very popular locally. But I think the real story here is the Labour vote collapse and the Reform surge.
Yeah, I just wanted us to talk about it briefly because although there was a lot of analysis, clearly I very plugged into South Wales in particular. So yes, the Tories and Labour together got 13%, 13%. Now that is absolutely totally historic collapse, and the Conservatives
11 and 2% respectively.
11 and 2%. The Conservatives lost 90% of their vote. Now, you might argue that Wales is not a very fertile ground for the Tories, and I would agree with you, but I think this did suggest that more Conservatives now are seeing Reform as a perfectly respectable option, which should worry the Conservatives at the national level. But what I wanted to say, Liam, is people didn't seem to really comprehend this. So the Senedd elections are going to be in May next year, and the voting system is changing to proportional representation using the D'Hondt method, which gives you 6-seat constituencies. So there are going to be 16 mega constituencies in Wales, each with 6 seats. But just to say that, yes, a lot of commentators correctly said that the Plaid Cymru victory was as a result of tactical voting, because a lot of Labour people and other parties may have thought, we don't want to vote for Starmer, but we'll go for Plaid. And so they did get a very handsome victory. But the situation, Liam, is that if you had that exact result again in May, Reform would pick up 3 of the 6 seats, right? So even if Reform is being beaten by Plaid in lots of the seats, I personally think that Labour has a small chance of hanging on to some seats in the university towns, in Cardiff, Aberystwyth and Swansea. I really think it's quite possible they may not get any seats at all. Let's just think about this, Liam. Labour last lost a seat in Wales in 1931. Okay, so it's hard to overstress how strong this is. But just to make the point that even if Reform isn't right out in front, even with a very chunky 36%, they are going to get a lot of seats in the Welsh Assembly in May.
Joining us on the Rocket today is Helen Whately, Conservative MP for Faversham and Mid-Kent and Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Elected to Parliament in 2015, Whately previously worked as a management consultant and media industry executive. Having grown up in a medical family, her political interests have centred on health and welfare. Her maiden speech in Parliament championed the NHS. Whately was Social Care Minister during lockdown and then a Treasury Minister, before resigning in 2022 in protest at Boris Johnson's leadership. She returned to the social care role under Rishi Sunak, then backed Kemi Badenoch, who appointed her to the Work and Pensions role. Over recent months, the Tories have toughened up their stance on fiscal stability and are now pledging to make £57 billion of savings, much of them within the welfare budget, which is Helen Whately's brief. Identifying welfare savings isn't easy, and with that in mind, I started by asking this horse-riding mum of 3 how she felt to be holding one of the toughest briefs in the shadow cabinet.
Well, as you say, it's a tough brief, but actually it's a brief that I wanted. When Kemi Badenoch became leader of the Conservative Party, I just said to her, I would really like to be Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, because it's something that I really care about. And I think there is, well, firstly, a huge opportunity in fixing the problems that we have in welfare as a country, and actually an imperative to do that as well. And it's one about the numbers and the savings we need to be made, but it's also a moral imperative to get people off benefits and into work. So to your question about, what's the scale of the challenge we face? I mean, firstly, in terms of people, There are around 10 million people who are of working age but economically inactive. 6.5 million people of working age who are on out of work benefits. One consequence of those figures is very large amounts of money being spent on welfare and those numbers going up particularly fast for sickness benefits. So we're heading up to spend as a country around £100 billion a year on sickness benefits by the end of this decade. Clearly a huge figure. And that's something which we can't afford for our economy, but also that means, as I said, it's millions of people who could be working but who are not working, and so they're not part of the productive economy. And on a human scale, they're not doing the things that you do when you go to work, not getting the opportunities you get through working, not getting the satisfaction you get from paying your bills, making a contribution. And actually, that I think is part of the moral case for welfare reform.
I'm so glad that you focused on the numbers. I know co-pilot Pearson will be as well. She is, as you know, Helen, the resident economist on Planet Normal, as she often tells me. But let's just reiterate these numbers. You mentioned some of them there in passing. When it comes to total welfare spending, it was £313 billion in the last fiscal year. And it's on course, according to the OBR, to be £373 billion by 2930 at the scheduled end of this parliament. That's a 19% increase. And you homed in on working age, health and disability benefits. The bill for those alone, of that 300 to 400 billion, the bill for those alone is going up from 75.8 billion in the last fiscal year to 97.9 billion. As you said, almost 100 billion by the end of this parliament. That's a 30% increase. Now, listeners will remember, just to finish, over the summer, that Labour, we're going to do welfare reform, says Keir Starmer. They were trying to slow down that rate of increase, weren't they? They were trying to take like that 75 billion to 97 billion increase. They were trying to make it a 75 billion to like a 92 billion pound increase. Yeah. It was never about cuts. It was about slowing down the rate of increase, and they failed.
They failed. I mean, that was one thing that was shocking before the summer recess, as you said, that they attempted to make some savings in the order of about 5 billion decrease in that rate of increase, exactly as you said. And what was completely clear in the chamber, particularly when we had the extraordinary moment when one of their ministers, Stephen Timms, literally stood up and intervened on a colleague to basically pull that legislation. So it turned actually into a spending bill. And the thing that MPs actually voted on, instead of saving or reducing that rate of increase by 5 billion, actually is forecast to cost about 300 million. So Labour backbenchers would only vote for more spending, not for welfare savings. I mean, it's just one reason why there's so little confidence in the Chancellor and the Prime Minister from the financial markets. There's no confidence that they can control this growth in public spending. The other thing, the figures you were talking about and looking as we tend to over this Parliament, but actually, if you look back to before the pandemic, the trajectory starts around the time of the pandemic, and actually you've got more like a 50% increase in real terms on sickness benefits from pre-pandemic through till the end of this decade. I think that's really worth looking at because we know that the pandemic was part of some trends of this steep rise in sickness benefits. So my view is actually we need to go back down to the levels that were before the pandemic and before we saw that change in trajectory.
What's it like working in this area, Helen? I'm sure, you have a very distinguished track record. You're from a medical family. You have a very strong background at working with charities, mental health charities, and so on. You're clearly a compassionate, decent person. And yet people say you're trying to take people's benefits away. You're being cruel. I mean, I've talked to Liz Kendall a lot over the years, the Secretary of State who oversaw those welfare reforms before the summer, which ended up in more welfare spending. I know she's banged her head against the wall trying to make these savings, which, as you rightly say, the country desperately needs because we're having to pay so much for our borrowing because financial markets don't trust the government to keep spending under control. What's it like working in this area when people are constantly accusing you of being cruel and heartless?
Well, for me, I mean, crucial to doing this job is going out and talking to people. I don't try and get a sort of judgment on what I'm doing from social media. That would probably make me pretty miserable. But it's from going out and talking to people and seeing what's happening on the ground. And that's what I find hugely motivating as a reason to fix this. When I'm going out there and I'm talking to people about how someone who wants to work but is genuinely stuck in a benefits trap. So someone recently who really wanted to become a painter decorator, was receiving PIP, had an opportunity to go on a course to be a painter decorator. There was a potential route into paying his own way in life, but he opted not to go on that course because he was worried that if he did that course, he would lose his benefits. And that was a man in his early 20s. And we know that only about 1 in 5 people who receive sickness benefits work. And the percentages coming off those benefits going into work are really low.
So it's a life sentence, in other words.
Exactly. It's a lifetime benefits, which is not a good way of life. I feel particularly strongly about what we're seeing with young people aged 18 to 25-year-olds, where you've got this particularly steep increase of people going onto sickness benefits. Now got 5,000 people a day going onto sickness benefits. It's being driven by people going on for common mental health conditions and neurodiversity like ADHD. That's exactly the age at which somebody should be going out and getting their first job.
Yeah.
I remember really well as a teenager, my first job. And after my first day at work, I earned £40. And as it happened, I was lucky I was still living with my mum and dad, and I could spend that money to go and get a pair of shoes. I remember the feeling of, well, that's my own money that I spent on what I want to spend it on, and the satisfaction of that. And I think we're at risk of having a generation who literally don't get that experience, and potentially a lifetime of not getting that experience. I think that's terrible.
Let's focus a little bit on those young people. I'm particularly worried about the Employment Rights Bill, which is obviously in its final parliamentary phases this week. It will end up with rights for workers similar to those in Spain. And of course, everyone wants workers to be treated well, but we also want firms to take people on. And in Spain, of course, unemployment's double what it is here. And for younger people, we've now got almost 1 million what we call NEETs, Helen Whately, those not in education, employment or training. That's a national tragedy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a disaster having 1 million young people who are, say, not in employment, education or training. So not going somewhere with their lives. And if you don't get going in the early part of your working life, it only ever gets harder. And as you all know as an economist, that a flexible labour market is an important way of making sure you have low unemployment. And what the government is doing is taking the country in the opposite direction. So we've seen unemployment go up month after month after month. With this government, it's now at a 4-year high. And every conversation I have with employers, and I'm talking a lot to employers about their part in supporting people who have health problems and disabilities to be in work and getting people from the local communities into work who are not. And they say the Employment Rights Bill means that they're even less likely to be competent recruiting somebody, employing somebody who doesn't have a good track record. They're no longer going to be able to take a chance on somebody. So people in the past who they've been able to take a chance on, and some become great long-term employees, they're not going to be able to do that anymore because of the extra restrictions that are being brought in by this government on employers. So on the one hand, the government said they really want to get down the number of NEETs, but on the other hand, those numbers are going in the wrong direction. And it's only going to get worse because of the decisions they're making.
Now, the Tories have been fiercely opposing that Employment Rights Bill. And I do think also that your party, with respect, has toughened up its message when it comes to fiscal responsibility and the need to tackle an overbearing state, even ahead of the budget at the end of this month, which is likely to increase our already 70-year high tax burden even more. The Tories are now saying you're going to make £47 billion worth of savings if you were in government. A lot of that will be coming out of your budget. Helen, how are you going to do it?
Yeah, so that's a lot of the work I've been doing over the last almost a year since I became Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, looking at what we would do differently from this government to get people off benefits into work. There's a moral imperative for doing that. It's also important to make savings. And we come at it as a party, and Kemi talks about this a lot, as applying our conservative principles, actually principles that we know that the vast majority of the population actually share. The importance of personal responsibility, people paying their own way, what's fair to the taxpayer, and welfare specifically as a safety net. That's what it should be when it's become a welfare trap in practice. And actually there are people who are making perfectly rational decisions which are resulting in them being on benefits rather than in work because they get more money and a more secure income through being on benefits. Actually, Fraser Nelson's been doing a lot of work shining a light on this as well. as has the CSJ, the Centre for Social Justice, and showing that actually you can be on an income of around £5,000 extra a year, as an example, if you're receiving benefits, including sickness benefits, rather than in work. So one of the areas where I've said the government could and should act, and they don't need to wait for the end of this parliament, it's what we would do if we were in government, but the government should get on with doing this in the meantime anyway, is to stop getting people onto sickness benefits for low-level mental health problems and neurodiversity. So that's things like mild depression, anxiety, and ADHD, because actually there's great evidence that tells us that people with those kind of challenges are much better off in work, and that the evidence is that work is better for your mental health, and also clearly is financially better for the country as well, for people to be in work rather than claiming benefits for those things. And that's an area that's been rising very steeply. That's something that we would do differently.
It's going to be very difficult, isn't it? Obviously, the Tories did your universal credit changes back in the day. They seem to have stuck. That they did improve incentives to get back into work, but clearly that work is incomplete. You mentioned Fraser Nelson, of course, former editor of The Spectator, but The Spectator isn't your problem, is it? Your problem are the broadcasters, the BBC and others, who will rail against this. The problem also, isn't it, some on the left of your party who will be very nervous. Those who have, fighting off Lib Dems in leafy southwest London and south of England seats and in the West Country. You say that a lot of the public agrees with you on this, and I suggest you're right. The silent majority of the public does, but a very, very vociferous lobby, including in the media, again, it's just going to call you cruel and heartless.
Well, I think we have to win the argument. The Motability scheme was set up as a scheme initially for people, for instance, military veterans who had amputations, to be able to get around with dignity for relatively small numbers of people. The scheme has expanded vastly, and literally in the last year, the government spending on it has increased by 10% to over £3 billion. So to me, this is an example of what has gone so very wrong with the benefit system, that something was intended as a safety net to enable dignity and independence for a small number of severely disabled people, has turned out in practice to be something very, very different, which makes it firstly very expensive, but actually for some people, it's even, from some of what you see on social media, it's actually become a reason for people to try and get benefits. And I've spoken out against this. And yes, I have had some criticism, for instance, on the ADHD front, even though members of my family have ADHD. But I've also had people posting on social media saying, hold on, I'm somebody who has ADHD and I work. Yeah. So actually, there are plenty of people who are backing me on this argument, saying this is not the welfare system we want or need. And it's also, it's not fair to taxpayers. It's also not fair and right for the people who do really need that help, that the welfare budget and people's goodwill is being spread across people who don't really need it.
You were, of course, a minister during lockdown. You were social care minister, I believe. Mm-hmm. What was that like? What was it like when the government was coming under so much criticism, not least here on Planet Normal from our listeners, when relatives weren't able to see their loved ones in care homes, often in very, very, very emotionally charged end-of-life situations?
I mean, it was an extraordinary and clearly awful time for me as social care minister, as it became clear the number of people who were dying in care homes, and that was horrific, particularly because in the early stage of the pandemic, so little we could do. When the virus got into a care home, it just spread around people and was in essence unstoppable, and that was incredibly difficult. So a lot of the work I did as care minister was about how can we put protections in place for care homes, whether that was PPE or when the vaccine came, getting that very quickly out to people and helping the sector through really difficult financial time as well. On the visiting, I mean, I felt really strongly about that from pretty early on in the pandemic, that at the very least, people should always be able to see their loved ones if they were dying. And our guidance included early on making sure that you could visit a relative if it was sort of end of life, be the terminology. And actually, many stages in the pandemic, I worked really hard to open up visiting. There was a lot of back and forth between me and our public health advisors. I've talked about this for the COVID inquiry for those who are really interested, and how
I know you've submitted evidence, obviously.
Many times, yes, and spoken at an inquiry, and how the public health advice that I was receiving was very strongly against visiting, but I felt very strongly that it was very important for the well-being of both residents in care homes and their family to be able to visit, which is why the kind of guidance evolved in various ways. It was very hard to keep people happy, and it also resulted in quite a few arguments between me and Boris, our Prime Minister at the time, about exactly this.
And finally, Helen, obviously your party is in a very, very difficult position. I'm sure you didn't expect to be polling, quite close to the Greens when you came into politics as a Conservative. In a nutshell, how does your party escape from this?
I think it was always going to be a difficult time for us following the period that we had in government, particularly with the pandemic. Most people don't want to think or talk about it anymore. That's sort of seen as in the past. But clearly, as a country, financially, we're still living with the consequences of it. And politically, as a party, we're living with the consequences of that. I spoke to a few former leaders of the Conservative Party in the time after the last general election about what would the next few years bring and how could we do a good job of being in opposition. And one of the things I was told on a few occasions was the first couple of years are just going to be really hard, and people are going to want you to show that you are listening, that you've taken on board the things that you got wrong. They're not going to really want to hear you defend your record, and they're not really going to want to hear that much from you. There's just going to have to be a couple of years when you keep your heads down, and then you can start arguing for what you want to do instead. And we're still in that couple of years, so it was always going to be really hard for us at this time. Something that I find really helpful in both the work I'm doing and the conversations I have with particularly my voters and my constituency, is us focusing on our principles and going back to what we really stand for and really sticking up for people. I have conversations with people saying, I'm working really hard, I'm doing the right thing, I go to work, building up my pension, whatever, and it all just feels really hard. And it doesn't feel like things are getting better. And we have to know that we're on the side of those people who want to do the right thing, who are working, who are saving. And that's the hard work we've got to do, saying what would we do for those people, who are most people, so that they know that the country is going to be better if they have a Conservative government after the next election.
Helen Whately, thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Thank you very much.
So there you go, Alison. Helen Whately, very much a core member of Kemi Badenoch's team. They are finding it very hard to punch through, if you like. But I do think there's signs of some life of thinking on the Tory front bench, not least as they've toughened up their message on fiscal policy. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought Helen Whately expressed it very well, and that there is not just a moral imperative, but for so many young people, 10 million of working age, Liam, economically inactive, and so many among the young. I mean, that's a tragedy, right? That's not just about saving money, although that's incredibly important, but it's so demoralizing for people. We need particularly the younger population to be in work and feeling motivated, and as well as paying tax. I think this is fruitful ground for the Conservatives, because I think that we're going to need someone to not necessarily deliver the bad news, but to be realistic, to say this is where we are. And we cannot go on like this. I mean, quite clearly, the numbers that you shared in your economics agenda column, which people will be able to find the link in the show notes, they're absolutely surreal. We're not going to be able to find 330 billion to keep people not working, are we?
Well, we just end up borrowing it. But in the end, the music will stop and the markets will refuse to lend to us as a country, except at absolutely usurious rates of interest. I do think there's a sense, Alison, as you captured in your cost of mints column, indeed, that people are finding it increasingly hard to make ends meet. I do think there's a sense that the headline rate of inflation numbers are nonsense. I mean, 3.8% is the official consumer price index inflation rate at the moment. Are you telling me it's only 3.8% more expensive to live than this time last year? Absolutely not. It's far more than that. We've got this employment rights bill going through Parliament. It's coming to its final stages, the battle between the Commons and the Lords. It is madness. It is madness to give people access to unfair dismissal rights from day one of employment, which will lead to lots of vexatious claims. It's madness to give the trade unions such power to enter into private sector companies and demand access to their internet records almost at the drop of a hat. And yet that is what is in Labour's legislation, again, to try and mollify the hard left in their party, in the Parliament and across the the country. These borrowing numbers came out last week, which I referred to in my Sunday column, borrowing £20 billion in a single month in September, 10 billion of which was payments for debt interest. So we're borrowing money on a huge scale in order to pay the interest on our existing debts. And we've seen this week, ahead of November the 26th, when there'll be Rachel Reeves' second budget, there are going to be big tax rises. She's now starting to admit that because she's already raised taxes by a huge amount. Her last budget in October 2024 was the biggest tax raising budget in over a quarter of a century. As many of us warned at the time, it massively slowed down the rate of growth, led to less hiring. The Employment Rights Bill will lead to even less hiring. A lack of tax revenue coming in compared to the forecast because of those ideologically high taxes, a total refusal to countenance any kind of spending cuts or even slowdowns in the rate of growth of spending, as Helen Whately and I were at pains to explain there in that interview. And so there are going to be a lot more taxes coming on November the 26th, and it gives me absolutely no pleasure to say that at all. Now on to our listener emails, the messages you send us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We'll hear so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
A huge amount of great feedback on Lord Glasman and Tracy Edwards, our guests at the Battle of Ideas. Alison and Liam, says Archie from Cardiff. Well done on your choice of guests. Lord Glasman was a revelation. I was listening to the live show at 4 a.m. this morning and giggling with his every utterance. Then one of our heroines from decades past stepped up. I wasn't even interested in sailing back then, but Tracy Edwards' heroics in the seas captured the imagination of the country we love. And for an underdog who showed she was every bit as good and competent as the next male sailor. A treat every week. Thank you, says Archie. And Peter in Cambridge. Hi, Alison and Liam. Last week's edition of Planet F, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That's not us. That's not us. We're not Planet F, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That's Maurice Glassman's description of Keir Starmer's Labour Party. It was riveting listening, says Peter. I've never heard Maurice Glassman in conversation before. If only the current Labour government shower was of his calibre. Humour, compassion, patriotism and practical politics. Don't think I've really listened to Tracy Edwards before either. What a star she is. I particularly enjoyed the part about her learning celestial navigation. My late father, a pilot for 46 years, including 8 years as a fighter pilot and 14 as a 747 captain, maintained that his proudest moment was his first time navigating a Boeing 707 across the pond by means of star shots, log tables and celestial charts. Each full calculation took 20 minutes, so 3 per hour with time for, as Dad put it, a slurp of cold tea. When they came in range of radar on the Canadian coastline, they got a fix and compared it to where he thought they were. So after at least a dozen calculations and travelling at 8 nautical miles per minute, he was only 2 miles out. Truly old school stuff. Keep it up, you two. The tide is slowly turning. Peter. Thanks, Peter.
Truly old school stuff. That's what you get when you grow up learning to use slide rules and log tables. Lots and lots of emails also, Alison, on Sarah Poachin and ethnicity in adverts. This is Richard. I saw the casting call from one of the main Christmas advert producers. It asked for your most diverse cast ethnically and culturally. That's code for trans, etc. It's deliberately, clearly directed. The aim of removing English-speaking white people has, of course, meant there's little work in adverts for those people. Starmer crowed about his utopia at the weekend as masked men marching through an East London borough screamed the familiar anti-Semitic battle cries. That is, of course, normal. And this is from Paul. What Sarah Poachin said about ethnic minorities overrepresented in adverts is factually correct. What gets on people's wicks, that's a good expression, Alison,
Yeah.
is that at any time it suits the left, then fair and proportional representation is shoved up our noses with a big victimhood song and dance. But also when it suits, it can be ignored completely, as in this case.
And here's Rosemary with a tough suggestion. I wonder why the government does not introduce a scheme where they pay the funeral costs of any person murdered by someone who arrived here as an illegal immigrant or asylum seeker. There could be a government representative to attend the funeral as an acknowledgement by the government that they are an innocent victim and a martyr to their wretched asylum policy. Perhaps have a memorial scroll somewhere to recognise their contribution. Oh, Rosemary, a bit close to the knuckle there.
And before we go, a couple of fun ones. The first is from Larry Limerick, who, of course, is the main rival at this stage to Bob the Bard, the pleasant, normal resident poet. Dear Rocketeers, says Larry, what's the point of the Bank of England having a 2% inflation target if the Bank of England hardly ever makes an effort to achieve it?
Good point.
It feels as though, as usual, those people who do the right thing, namely try and save for a rainy day, be self-reliant, save for their retirement, save to help their children with university costs, get hammered as their savings get devalued. Is my economics up the spout? And here's a limerick, says Larry Limerick, tutor form. There once was a PM called Keir who liked to lead from the rear. Racist, he'd shout. Of that there's no doubt. But Brits didn't follow his steer.
Boom, boom.
And finally, Alison, we were going to do this in the presence of the brilliant Tracy Edwards, but we ran out of time when we were recording our live edition at the Battle of Ideas. So we'll do this now. This is Bob the Bard again. I'm afraid he's muscled his way into our email Hall of Fame once more. Dear Planet Normal, over the last few months, I've heard various people say that the government is spending money like a drunken sailor. I'm afraid that those words have inspired me to write a song about the forthcoming autumn budget in the style of a famous sea shanty. And that's why we wanted Tracy Edwards around. Thanks again for Planet Normal, says Bob. Let's hope Britain manages to keep its head above water. Boom, boom.
Boom, boom.
So here it is. What will they do in the autumn budget? To be sung to the tune of What Shall We Do with a Drunken Sailor? And I'm going to do the verses, Alison, and you're going to come in on the chorus.
Okay, no pressure.
So, what will they do in the autumn budget? Spending's too high. Will they cut it or just tax us more to fund it? Early in the morning. Hooray, taxation rises. Will it cause a jump in prices? Could it spark a sterling crisis? Early in the morning. What will they do with the nation's riches? Pander to the union's wishes. Send our money to Mauritius early in the morning. Hooray, taxation rises. Will it cause a
jump in prices?
Could it spark a sterling crisis? Early in the morning. What will they do to our industry? Scare away the ones we need just to keep Ed Miliband pleased early in the morning. What will they do to the debt we're owing? It looks bad the way we're going. Debt's the only thing that's growing early in the morning. Hooray, taxation rises. Will it cause a jump in prices? Could it spark a sterling crisis?
Early
In the morning. Hooray! And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week. It's your turn, Alison.
I think Peter in Cambridge for lovely remarks about the Maurice Glasman and Tracy Edwards episode, which we enjoyed so much. Peter, send us an email to Planet Normal with mug winner in the subject and with your name and address, please.
And we'll send you that much coveted Planet Normal mug. If you've enjoyed this episode of Planet Normal, please subscribe. Leave a review and rating wherever you listen, whether it's on Spotify or YouTube or the podcast app. Thanks finally to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, here's goodbye from me.
Praise to Bob's internal rhyming, by the way, and it's goodbye from him.